My name's Robert Schnase, and I'm Bishop of the Rio, Texas Conference, and for me it's a privilege to be here and a part of this conversation today. And I just want to say that I give God thanks for every one of you and for all that you do for the purposes of Christ and for the United Methodist Church. Mi nombre es Robert Schnase y soy obispo de la Conferencia Rio, Texas. Para mí es un privilegio de estar aquí con ustedes y doy gracias a Dios por cada uno de ustedes y por todo lo que hacen para la misión de Cristo y para la misión de la Iglesia Metodista Unida. I look around this room and I think of all the relationships that go back, some of them for 30 and more years. Some of us were visiting from the former Southwest Texas Conference, former Rio Grande Conference, and I really do give God thanks for all of you. And I thank you for giving up the time to travel to this place, to learn more, study more, and just open our minds and hearts to the possibilities that God may have as we approach these important decisions in these months to come. I was asked to serve on the commission somewhere in kind of late summer 2016, and I said no. And so I was asked again, and I said no again. And then finally, 2 or 3 people ganged up on me and started saying, we really think you ought to join the commission. And I still wasn't convinced until I began to read what was put together as the mission, vision, and scope statement that gave direction to the commission. And these lines captured my heart. The commission will design a way for being church that maximizes the presence of United Methodist witness in as many places in the world as possible, that allows for as much contextual differentiation as possible, and that balances an approach to different theological understandings of human sexuality with a desire for as much unity as possible. So I was not going to invest that many months and days of my life into just trying to stabilize an institution or to deal with some petitions that have been an impasse for some years. What caught my attention is this notion that we might possibly make some decisions that would cause us to multiply the mission and ministry of the United Methodist Church. Because our way of expressing the Christian faith is distinct, and it's not to say it's better than other families of the Christian faith, but there are people that we are able to reach that other branches of the Christian family are unable to reach. That there is a unique expression that comes out of our Wesleyan heritage, and part of that unique expression is the fact that we've managed to get along for so many years without all agreeing on everything. That we bear witness to the world that we can be one church, that we can be one church. So I'm going to take a few minutes here. I'm sorry I didn't have slide PowerPoint things, but I'm still learning to use a ballpoint pen. I have not yet gotten to all of it. So how many of you have had the chance to actually sit down and read, I'm going to embarrass everybody, the 93 pages of the report? Okay? Well, if you have not, I encourage you to do so. And as you prepare to do this, you don't have to sit down and swallow all this in one gulp. I divide it into 5 stacks. And the first stack is all the preliminary material that talks about what happened at General Conference, the formation of the commission, its work, the theological foundations, the ecclesiological kind of frameworks that are behind this. That's kind of all just kind of to prepare the way. And some of the things that drove all 3 of these plans. And it has the mission, vision, and scope page as well. And then a second stack would be the One Church plan. And that includes its description as well as its petitions. And then the third stack would be the Connectional Conference plan. And the same thing there. It has explanations and then the petitions. And the fourth stack is the traditionalist plan, and same thing there. And then the fifth part of this is a report from the General Board of Pensions, Westpath, and I'd invite you also to kind of review that, and we're going to hear more about that tomorrow. But that makes it a bit more digestible, and I agree with Bishop Jones that you would benefit the church by becoming more familiar with these plans. Now, I'm aware of there's so many ways of looking at this, but we've got some values that we hold as United Methodist Church that sometimes are in conflict with each other, and we don't think of them in that way. And one of them is everyone supports the unity of the church, But also everyone, to some degree, believes that ministry should be contextual, that the tools you need in one place are not necessarily the tools that you will need in another place. And this varies from church to church within our communities. It varies from parts of the country. It varies between churches in the United States and churches in Africa. That we have different practices and we need different tools. And then we have this, we desire relationship and connection, but we also value space. That's something the Commission heard over and over. Now, space is not the same as contextuality. Contextuality says, give me the tools to do my ministry here, and you can have the tools to do your ministry there. Space means I need some distance from folks who feel differently or practice differently than me. I mean, in extreme form, this means I cannot imagine preaching under a cross and flame if somewhere else someone is doing same-gender weddings under a cross and flame, right? I need space from that. So, and then it's centralized and decentralized. And are our impulses to tighten up our systems or to loosen them up? Now, you can kind of play with this line here like one of those slider switches that our sound people are using. And if you go too far over here to the unity, completely leaving behind contextuality, what you fall into is a kind of uniformity, that everyone must not only believe the same, but practice the same. If you go all the way here to contextuality, what happens to the unity? We hardly see any common connections between the ministry here and the ministry there. Relationship and space, a similar thing. If we come strongly on the relationship in here, people don't feel like they have the space to exercise. They feel like they're going to be seen through the eyes of how people see other United Methodists. And if too much space, then there's hardly any connection left at all. And the same with these others. And I would, I'm not here to argue against other plans. I'm here to present the one church plan. But it is a helpful kind of way of thinking about how do these plans form out. So the attempt of the connectional conference plan is to grant more contextuality, almost to the point that it comes close to being three different denominations that are nevertheless kind of related the way Methodist bodies are under the World Methodist Conference. You know, I would suggest that the traditionalist model that includes some of what we heard today risk maybe being pretty strongly over here. Same way with these over here. And what the one church model is an attempt to do is to work someplace in here to grant, to multiply the ministry and witness of the United Methodist Church in as many places as possible, in as many ways as possible, while also maintaining a sense of unity. So the one church model is a plan to create a home for everyone, a way forward for all of us. It's about one church. It asks no one to leave. It asks no one to leave. So what are the implications of this plan for different elements of our church? I've appreciated the way Bishop Muller and Bishop Jones have followed pretty much the outline that you have in this commission report. And that is starting with local churches. Most likely, most United Methodist churches would not be deeply affected by the one church model. They'd continue ministry the same way they did. They'd be doing the same ministries the day after the called session as they would be the day before the called session, because all those needs don't go away. All those ministries are still important. Traditionalist congregations would still act and behave and believe as traditionalist congregations. Progressive congregations would continue to act and believe and practice as progressive congregations. The default, some people say the local church one is a local option and every church must vote. If you actually read the petitions, the default is that our churches would not do same-gender weddings on their properties, but that a congregation with a session of their church conference could vote to change their wedding policies to make that possible. So it gives more freedom to one part of our church. What about the appointment process and its effect on local congregations? Well, here you have the concern that we're a traditionalist congregation. What if we get a very progressive bishop? And if we're a progressive congregation, are we going to be sent a very traditionalist pastor? Well, folks, for the most part, those are already taken into consideration in our current appointment process. Now, some churches, some bishops have been talking, about how would they handle things in their own annual conferences. And there have been ideas such as annual conferences actually kind of make agreements with congregations, especially about if they're ordained gay and lesbian pastors, of kind of working with a congregation to say, if that is something that you cannot imagine working in your search situation, we're willing to work with you on that, and kind of vice versa. But already the way virtually all bishops operate is they're not going to send a pastor who's an active member of the Reconciling Church movement, Reconciling Ministries movement, to a very heavy traditionalist church, or vice versa, right? That's just kind of a prescription for disaster. So what about the implications for clergy? Again, they all continue to belong to the same annual conference that they did before any of this would be enacted. The traditionalists would continue to do their ministry in the way that they have before. They would have special protections built into this to assure that they would never have to do anything contrary to their convictions or their scriptural interpretation, which means that the language throughout this petition is shall not be compelled nor prohibited from performing same-gender weddings. So the pastor has that choice. Now, if this is a pastor who's good at engaging the mission field where he or she is sent, then they're probably going to perhaps do this differently in one setting than they would in another, because there's no reason for them to go to war against their own congregations, right? So so congregations would, through their trustees, through their church conference, have the ability to say, well, could these weddings be performed on our property? To the pastor would be the discernment of, would they perform gay and lesbian weddings, right? And so actual fact, when I've looked at some of the other denominations that have dealt with some of the issues that we now are engaging, one I remember talking to, who I'm not going to give even the judicatory because it will give a clue to the denomination, but after a lot of struggle over this, of whether churches would have the right to do this, out of 130 some odd churches, 5 churches asked to have permission to do same-gender weddings, and 7 or 8 years into that decision, only 2 of those churches had actually done it. I don't know how that would play out in your conference. It'd be different from conference for conference. And as far as effect on clergy, this would bring an end to almost all church trials as they are currently being conducted for violation of the discipline. What about the impact on annual conferences? This is the only plan in which there really is no planned vote at annual conference. So in the connectional conference plan, the conference kind of has to decide, are they going to go with the branch that their jurisdiction does, okay? In the traditionalist plan, there's a conference has to, by some means, certify that they will remain and to follow the discipline, or they'll have to consider another denominational body. Boards of ordained ministry at the annual conference level would discern whether or not someone met the credentials and met the requirements, had the gifts and graces and fruit for ministry. There would be conferences where that would be the only criteria they would use. There would be other conferences that might well set a policy that says, in our conference we do not ordain gays or lesbians. In another conference there might be almost an explicit action by the Board of Ordained Ministry to make it clear that they would recommend the ordination, okay? If someone has the gifts and graces and fruit for ministry. Council of Bishops continues as one body. Bishops are neither compelled nor prohibited from ordaining LGBT persons. Again, there are questions, and some of this would take some time to live out. It's kind of, do we want to make the commitment to try and make this happen, or do we not? But if, so I can imagine a situation in which a conference, Board of Ordained Ministry, may vote to credential someone and to ordain them, and the bishop in that area, for reasons of conscience, their scriptural interpretation, simply would feel that he or she could not do that. Well, already in the United Methodist Church, there are instances where bishops do courtesy ordinations in another conference for someone whose relationship is in this conference. So when I served in Missouri, there were an example or two where someone came through our credentialing system but was actually ordained at the ordination service of another bishop in another conference for family reasons or for other extenuating circumstances. So there are ways to think this through. Also, most of our ordination services right now have more than one bishop participate in them, because often who we have at annual conference, either as a speaker or on the stage with us, are retired bishops or visiting bishops from other conferences. General agencies. The general agencies of the United Methodist Church continue their ministry as they are now. As a matter of fact, all the connective tissue of the United Methodist Church right now stays intact. What about United Methodist-related institutions? So here, I don't know what comes to mind when you hear United Methodist-related institutions. I think of colleges and universities, but I also think of our seminaries. I think of in many of our communities, these large Methodist healthcare systems, Methodist healthcare ministries. And many of these take great satisfaction and and it is formative to their identity to have the cross and flame and to identify as connected to the United Methodist Church. In San Antonio, where I serve, I'll be driving through some part of San Antonio. Sometimes I get lost. I have as much trouble with my GPS as I do with PowerPoints, and so sometimes I'll end up in a neighborhood and I'll turn around a corner, and there's this just amazing, bright new facility that has a giant cross and flame on it, and it's one of our Methodist healthcare systems, hospitals, or clinics. It's one of the ministries of Methodist healthcare ministries. And so when I think of institutions, I think of these robust institutions, Duke and Candler and Southern Methodist University, and maybe colleges in your area or hospital systems in your area. And so when we try to think, and I'm not trying to let the tail wag the dog. This isn't all about them, but they are part of who we are in our United Methodist witness. And so when I think about those who long ago adopted, most of those long ago adopted non-discrimination policies related to LGBT persons as employees, spouses, patients, and most of those institutions don't want to have to choose one branch in some kind of three-branch or multi-conference system, nor do many of those want to communicate back to their boards and to their constituencies a much harder line around LGBT issues. Finances and pensions. We're going to hear more about that tomorrow from someone who works on the staff of the Board of Pensions. You'll learn about how the key holder of our pensions programs are our annual conferences. They're the plan sponsors. And so one of the things we have to be conscious in any of these plans is what's the level of stability of the annual conference. Because on something, and clergy will know what I mean, many laity will, pre-82 liabilities, those continue to stretch out into the 2040s, early 2050s, and CRSP, which all of us clergy pay into, those liability tails go out to the 2090s. And who is being held liable for those? It's annual conferences. And so whatever we go, wherever we do with this, we've got to realize how critical it is to maintain healthy conferences in some form. As far as other financial Episcopal Fund issues, the plan proposes that salaries be paid, I think this is the way other plans are too, that the salaries of bishops and be paid by the areas in which they are appointed. And that is because there are folks on kind of both sides of this issue, both the polarities of this issue, who have trouble seeing their giving, their denominational dollars through apportionments, going to support a bishop who practices in a way that's contrary to what they believe is right. Well, I'm not sure that I have a problem with the idea of areas paying the salaries of bishops. That's kind of replicates what we do at the local church level. Local churches pay for their pastors' salaries, but the conference sets the guidelines and sets the minimum salary. Describes various things about the insurance and pensions requirements and so forth. So that's a part of this. I think one of the critical things that has not been mentioned much today that I think we've just got to really give deep consideration to, and that is the impact of any of these on our Central Conference brothers and sisters. And for those of you still learning the United Methodist language, this is our churches, our pastors, our conferences, our bishops in Africa, in Europe, in the Philippines, Eurasia. And so this is a highly sensitive subject, and it differs from different places in the world. In Africa, most of the countries in Africa, as a matter of fact, all but just a few, simply being gay or lesbian is a crime. And talking about these things in public or teaching about these things in public can have extraordinary consequences. And so we've got to be sure that whatever we do includes conversation and engagement with our brothers and sisters around the world. And what they want most of all is to have space so that whatever the United States practice is, they don't have to change their fundamental beliefs and their fundamental practices in the areas and regions where they serve. And I think we have to honor that. The other thing as we think about the central conferences is while they are robust in their evangelism, so much of kind of the undergirding of financial and prayer support and just community support across the world comes from the United Methodist Church in the United States. And so we need a robust United Methodism in the United States for there to be a robust United Methodism in other parts of the world. You may be thinking, what's the plan that is not going to cause disruption in our church? I got some news for you. So there's 5 possible scenarios. Actually, there's probably 120, but I'm not going to raise your anxiety any. 5 possible scenarios of what's going to come out of the cold session. Number 1, the one church model is going to be adopted. Number 2 is the connectional conference model plan is going to be adopted. Number 3, the traditionalist plan is going to be adopted. Number 4, I'm going to cheat on this one, some modification of one of those 3 previous plans will be adopted. In other words, one of these will be lifted up, but it will be modified on the floor of General Conference. Or the 5th is nothing happens at all, nothing changes in the book of discipline, and we all go home with exactly where we are today. Now, if you're thinking, well, if it's this last one, then everything's going to just continue the way it is, I don't think that's the case. I think there are progressives that will say enough is enough and we just can't imagine continuing on to this. But a whole lot of progressives that say we're going to continue to step forward and let our voices be counted and try and change future other general conferences. But there are also, if everything remains the same, there will be traditionalists that say, because we're not heightening accountability to enforce the discipline as it is, I'm just losing patience with this, right? Nothing has changed. Nothing has changed. So any one of these has a level of disruption, and I think we've got to take that into account. It means doesn't mean we run around, and multiplying the anxiety of these possibilities. But I think there's never been a more important time for people in the roles that you serve in as pastors, as district superintendents, as bishops, as laypersons, as lay leaders of your annual conferences, as delegates. There's never been a more important time to have a steady hand. The fullest cup requires the steadiest hand. And this needs to be a time of prayer and conversation. Some people have said, now how is the one church model, how is it different from this is just no different from what's already come before General Conference for many quadrennia. And I'd beg to differ. Number one, the proposals that came from the Commission and then through the Council of Bishops, we were asked by the General Conference to do this. We were commissioned by the General Conference to do this. We were commissioned by the Council of Bishops to do this. And that makes it different from just voices over here offering one set of petitions and voices over here offering another set of petitions. We were asked to do this work and find a way forward. Second, this is brought by, the work of the Commission is brought by constituencies with fundamentally opposing points of view. Most of the petitions that have traditionally gone to annual General Conference about LGBT issues are brought by either a conservative traditionalist point of view or a progressive point of view, and it's like win or lose. The plans that came out of the Commission have been worked over, prayed over, written by people across the theological spectrum. Also, in the past, virtually all of these petitions, one way or the other, have been submitted by U.S. constituents, U.S. Members or conferences, and hardly ever on LGBTQ issues by the central conferences. And the recommendations that came out of the Commission had active engagement and considerable engagement with the central conferences. And another difference is while there have been efforts by progressives to just take out the restrictive language in the Book of Discipline before, this doesn't do that. This removes that restrictive language, but goes, as a matter of fact, virtually all the energy into writing the new church, the one church model is into how to give protections for traditionalist or more conservative views and to give space to the central conferences. I mean, if all this was is pull out the restrictive language, well, that's been a proposal for 40 years, right? This is different. This says we envision a United Methodist Church where there is room for everyone. And we don't want anybody. We don't want anybody to leave. We want to do everything we can to make sure that the integrity of your ministry continues on, that the integrity of your ministry lives on. At 4 p.m, I submitted to be more vile. Yeah, one of my teachers for evangelism when I was in Perkins, by the way, I hope you're not, I hope you have some idea of where I'm going with this, and not what you might be thinking. David Lowes Watson was one of my teachers in evangelism, and he talked about the absolutely key changing moments in the life and ministry of John Wesley. And of course, one of those is the heart strangely warmed moment, the Aldersgate moment, when he realized that all this talk was about him, was about him, God's love for him, God's grace for him, that he was forgiven. But the other turning point moment that Dr. Watson used to talk about, because he's the professor of evangelism, he says one of the absolute, probably two most critical moments in his ministry is when John Wesley decided to go preach in the open fields and step out of the parish church. And reflecting on his experience, he writes in his diary, at 4 p.m, I submitted to be more vile and proclaimed on the highways the glad tidings of salvation, to reach people who were never going to be reached by the traditional church of his time. I love the United Methodist Church. I love the people in this room. At least 60% of you and a few more, or your predecessors, had something to do with me being able to stand on this stage and to fulfill this part of my calling as a bishop of the United Methodist Church. And I don't want to be a church that is so separated that I end up serving in a monocultural church, a church where everybody thinks pretty much like I do. That isn't the church that brought me in and taught me this expression of the Christian faith when I was confirmed. That isn't the church that I was ordained into. That isn't the church that I was consecrated to supervise and to protect the unity of. So thank you for your time, and thank you so much for your gracious listening to all three of these plans. As has already been said, who knows what is going to happen. I just hope that however it happens, it's done with a gracious spirit, that it's done with a kind of mutual respect and dignity, and that we remember that this is not just a subject out there to be discussed. These are persons. These are persons who are our sisters and brothers and children and are members of our congregations and who participate already in almost all aspects of our ministry. God bless you and thank you for your time.